Welcome back to another edition of Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. I'm your host, Sebastian Lebrec. If you're a regular listener, you know that housing is a topic we often talk about on the podcast. It's something all levels of government and quite frankly most voters care about because it's a huge part of everyday life. But in order to build homes, we need the underlying infrastructure to be present and adequate. In most cases, if there's no water or electricity, there's probably no housing. To look into these important issues, the Government of Canada established the Canadian Infrastructure Council, which brings together experts from infrastructure-related fields. The council was tasked with delivering the first National Infrastructure Assessment, or NIA for short. The assessment focused on the infrastructure needed to support more housing over the long term. The NIA was released last November, and one of the members of the council joins us today to talk about the assessment. Dr. Ren Thomas is a registered professional planner and an associate professor at the School of Planning at Dalhousie University. Dr. Thomas has conducted extensive research in housing policy, transportation policy, and planning over the course of her career. So it's the perfect time to talk about this issue, and we have the perfect guest. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, let's set the stage a little bit. Could you give us an overview of the context for this first NIA?
Yeah, sure. So the first NIA, which was released just a couple months ago, it really is the first one of its kind because it gives us an idea of the kind of infrastructure that we need if we're going to build all this new housing in Canada, and it is driven by this kind of really broad base of evidence. And I think this is really critical at a time when we have like a lot of population growth and we have climate change that is really putting a lot of pressure on these infrastructure systems. So we're looking at, where do we have shortages, but we're also looking at, in these three types of areas of infrastructure, how can we better plan this infrastructure? How can we better, finance it, maintain it? And, these are hopefully this NIA is going to help us make, longer, better long-term kind of decision making across Canada.
So you mentioned the categories of infrastructure. We have water and wastewater, waste management, and public transit and active transportation. We'll discuss all three, but you're a professor, so you grade papers and assignments from students every day. So what mark would you give Canada's infrastructure as it stands today?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I thought about this question. It's a very mixed picture, right? Because as you know, we have a very large country. We have a lot of variation by region and community type. So I think I would say, there's a lot of places where the infrastructure is still functioning quite well in a lot of places, but it's under strain, I would say, and especially where we have high population growth. So some of our larger cities, but also some of our rural areas that are now under increased, climate pressure. So the prairies, the coastal areas of the country. So we have, some of our infrastructure, about 11% of the infrastructure across the country is in very poor condition. So in this case, we have communities that are really relying on systems that they've outgrown. Like they just, they have a higher population than they used to, or they have different climate stresses like droughts and flooding and that kind of thing. So I think it's pretty hard to to do a single grade for the whole country because there's so much variation. It's a tough one.
Fair enough. It was worth me asking. So let's look at the different categories now, starting with water and wastewater infrastructure. I know that's something we hear our municipal clients talk about quite a bit. Could you tell us what kind of state that type of infrastructure is in? What are some of the challenges?
Yeah, I think one of but again, we have a certain percentage, about 10% of those wastewater assets are in poor or very poor condition. And the estimated replacement for those is like $107 billion. Like it's a huge cost. And now this is, again, deterioration. Some of these systems are older. We have underground pipes, of course. We have seen system failures in some cities and that kind of thing. The other real issue with water is Canadians are, very bad on sustainability we consume a lot of water and part of that is because we don't have water metering in some places. Some places we do, and so people are paying per gallon that they use or whatever, but per liter that they use, but in other places they're not. So that's a real factor, is if we bring metering into those areas that we don't have it already, that would take down our consumption of water, which would put less stress on these systems, because of course we have to clean our drinking water and that kind of thing, right? The other main issue with water is about there is a high degree of loss. I mean, like about 17% of our drinking water is lost on its way to the end user because of leaks in the system. And so, yeah, so this is another main issue that we see with the water and wastewater infrastructure. And we know with population growth, like there is, we need to kind of have these incentives to reduce our consumption to begin with, but also we need to, repair that infrastructure so that we aren't losing the precious drinking water that we have.
So when you mention water gets lost, are we literally talking about leaky pipes?
Yeah, we're literally talking. Yes, it's something that is is what I guess well known in among our members that of our council that deal with water and wastewater, but also like the people because we did so much outreach with the NIA as well, right? Like in last spring, this is something we heard from users and people who are maintaining our systems as well. We are actually it's not a very efficient system either that we have right now. So yeah. And we still know there's also these service gaps in certain, with indigenous communities. Like still like 39 communities, I think, that have drinking water advisories, right? So there's also kind of, again, there's some regional or disparities between communities.
So I'm going to ask you about the state of solid waste management infrastructure now, and I'm hoping you're not going to tell me about leaky pipes again.
I know. No, actually, our solid waste infrastructure, at least the one what is publicly owned, is in pretty good shape. Actually, we're diverting more of our solid waste from landfills than we used to. Let's say 20 years ago, if we look at the change from 2002 to 2022, we have seen an increase in the solid waste that's being diverted and going into recycling and that kind of thing. But we do know there's parts of the country, in particular, again, the remote and northern communities that really, and some parts of Ontario and Quebec that are facing in the future, like they have kind of low like reserves of land set aside for landfills or landfill capacity. So that's the main issue with the solid waste is that right now everything's functioning very well, but we're talking about 20 years from now, there's some communities that have like maybe don't have the capacity set aside for growth in the landfills. Yeah.
And it's for our listeners in Ottawa, this is a very live topic.
Yeah, and having lived in Toronto, like this topic comes up a fair amount, right? Like solid waste and like what do you do when you have these urban constraints? So there is a limit of like what land like you have, and so I think part of it is diverting more of that from landfills to begin with. But there are again many parts of the country that lack engineered landfills, recycling depots because of the high cost of that and logistical barriers. Like if you're in like northern Alberta or northern Manitoba or something, it's or the territories. Those types of infrastructure are few and far between.
So the next category is, I know, one you deeply care about, public transit and active transportation infrastructure. So what were the key takeaways there?
Well, I think probably not surprising to most. I mean, I think we move into this era where we are very concerned about the environment, we want to make less impact. It is important that we have transportation options for people that are not private vehicles, right? So that part of the reason we included like active transportation as well, like walking and cycling. I mean, those are really viable options for a lot of people. But we still have, something like 79% of Canadians are still using the car for, like a private car for their commute to work. So it is still a pretty significant issue in Canadian cities. There's a lot of, there is actually some lack of data, like in some of these areas, especially with active transportation. Like we don't have a full picture of, the resources we have for cycling paths and walking paths and that. Like I think about 40% of it is actually unknown. So if you look at we also, in addition to the NIA, we published these 3 papers in October called State of Play, and there's one on each of the 3 asset areas. So if you look at the transportation and active transport paper, you can see there's quite a lot of missing data in there. And then even for what we know about about 13% of public transit assets were in very poor condition. So again, that's a pretty major amount to we're talking about probably $15 billion of replacement costs.
So when we were doing our prep call, you mentioned something interesting. You said that governments historically have not planned for housing and transportation together. Could you elaborate on this? And when did things change, in your opinion, if they have changed?
Since at least the 1950s, the way that we've planned housing and transportation have really been it's really been in silos. So they've been two separate things. Often, if it's they're both at a municipal level, they're completely different departments. They sometimes don't share data, and so we've kind of got this low density land use patterns where the only real option for a lot of people is private vehicles, and that obviously drives congestion, all that kind of thing. So I think what has changed is I think beginning in the 90s is like there's been some public health concerns about the way we're building our communities, like people walking less, especially kids walking less and cycling less to schools and that kind of thing. There's also been basically that we just can't afford to keep building in this way because the way that we're building our housing in our neighborhoods, like in terms of the layout, like suburban layouts, really depended on cheap gasoline, basically cheap fossil fuels. And so we can't really afford to build that way anymore. It just doesn't really make sense. So it's kind of essential to just from an economic point of view, from a sustainability point of view, to start building in a different way. And really, it's so if thinking about when things have changed, it's like I do think things that started to change in the 90s, we start to get a little bit more compact development, some concentration on let's say transit-oriented development, but it hasn't really made its way into Canadian cities in a huge way. And it's really quite recent that at the federal level anyway, that housing and transportation have been conceived of together.
One of the key points of our conversation so far is this notion of, regional differences and how, it's in economics, sometimes we talk about it in this way. If you talk about the weather, if I were to ask you, what's the weather in Canada today? You would be like, well, I'm in Halifax, you're in Ottawa. Like, how are we supposed to say there's a weather? Well, I think a key takeaway is that it's similar for infrastructure. And I know the NIA has a chapter on tailoring infrastructure to regional realities. So what are some of the most consequential regional differences highlighted in there?
Well, there are some very different climate risks I've already kind of alluded to. For example, the north, we have permafrost that's thawing now, so that really makes it difficult to build infrastructure that's stable because there's going to be change over time. We have droughts and wildfires in the prairies. We have, more flooding and heat extremes in other parts of the country, like obviously on coastal areas and that. We also have if you look at across the country, there's something like there's quite a few like very small communities which are less than 5,000 people in population cover about like 85% of our of our census subdivision. So it's actually the vast majority of our communities are very small, and we have like eight communities that are considered very large, right? And everything else is small. So that those smaller communities, again, it is very challenging to actually build in those places, but. Some of those, like in BC in particular, those small places are expected to grow quite significantly. And so there is, if you think about BC, yes, those small communities are going to grow a lot, but also they have extreme heat, they have wildfires, they have drought, there might be flooding, there's all these risks. The main, yeah, so there is quite a lot of difference across the country in terms of how communities are growing, the type of communities they had to begin with, and then what are the kind of climate risks. I think those are the main kind of differences.
And I think from a regional perspective, and DNIA notes that another key component, I suppose, is access to workers to build those homes, right? And I know it's a challenge perhaps for smaller communities. So I'd be kind of curious to hear your thoughts on the workforce dimension of infrastructure. Is that something that came up during your work?
Oh yeah, quite a lot. Like when we did engagement with all these different professionals, we had those experts and people from municipalities and people from the engineering side and all that who basically this came up quite a lot that we have this lack of skilled trades in Canada, and that is kind of it's contributing to delays, it's contributing to increased costs for infrastructure projects, and it is particularly bad in the smaller and remote communities. And so you do see this wasn't a huge focus of of the NIA report, but it's something we definitely heard a lot. I will say from some of the work I did in up in Nunavut that, there's some province, territories like Nunavut are actually taking a real workforce, like a real approach to expanding their workforce. They're training the Inuit. The college up there it has specific programs targeted to Inuit youth and in the construction fields, like in carpentry and electrical. And so I think some of the provinces are doing a lot to kind of increase recruitment and training of young people in these areas, but it's definitely an issue.
So we've focused on the three categories of infrastructure, but obviously when a community grows, you need things like schools, daycare, rec facilities, the local pool, and I could go on and on. So could you tell us where social infrastructure fits into the discussion we're having today?
Yeah, this is something that actually came up. We just met in person with the council last week in Ottawa, and we met with the minister Gregor Robertson and the deputy minister Paul Haluka, and they did bring up this issue of social infrastructure and how important it is. And I think that really that really speaks to the mayor, the former mayor of Vancouver, and the way that Vancouver has really attacked this issue of through development, community amenity contributions and development charges that really do improve this area or really kind of help fund this area of social infrastructure. So again, like I would say, like even though we didn't focus on this area of infrastructure for the NIA, the last NIA anyway, that it may be like a lot of the things that we've talked about, like the water and wastewater and the transportation and all those things still apply to the social infrastructure. We know that we need like these complete communities. We need livable communities.
So everything we've talked about today, obviously, it has a cost, and it's not cheap. And all levels of government are dealing with their own financial pressure. So could you speak to the financial dimension of infrastructure and perhaps, what came up in the NIA context?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the biggest constraints in infrastructure kind of delivery right now. And we know like local governments own and operate the vast majority of the infrastructure that we're talking about here. And their main they're relying basically on property taxes, user fees, development charges, and then some funding from other levels of government for major infrastructure projects, right? Now these because of the cycle of municipal governments and balancing budgets and all that, like some of these sources don't really align very well with like infrastructure is such a long-term issue. It's such a thing that needs to be thought of in the longer term. So we know that. And again, from our kind of our experts that we consulted, that it's just government funding or public funding is really not going to be sufficient. And so one of the things we were just talking about in our last meeting was alternative financing and kind of the greater kind of PPPs and all this kind of basically greater participation from the private sector and innovative financing approaches that kind of are basically sharing these risks and focusing on long term. And some of that even comes down to issues like procurement was something we talked about in the last meeting, like looking at sort of alternative ways of kind of writing these contracts so that we have like less yeah, I guess less cost overruns in the end, so that we kind of bring some of the risk back into some of these processes, right? Rather than going with kind of, let's say, the lowest bid on projects. Like there's better ways of kind of choosing consultants for these. So that's something we've been talking about a lot too.
It's interesting because procurement is definitely a very hot topic. So it's interesting that you mentioned it. I do want to ask you about climate resilience and climate change more generally. I know this is also a topic you care about, but it seems to me like the broader climate agenda is kind of being put on the back burner by governments across Canada and really across North America. So given this dynamic, is there like a risk that climate resilience falls out of the conversation in the context of housing and infrastructure?
I mean, I think there is always a risk, but in our work, we're basically finding that you can't really separate those things. You can't really separate climate resilience from infrastructure decisions and housing decisions. Like, and we had confirmation from the minister and the deputy minister last week that resilience, I think, was what was if not the first thing they mentioned, it was maybe the second thing they meant. It was definitely still at the top of their minds. So I think what we found is that their climate impacts are really there's already disruption to our infrastructure systems, right? We have boil water advisories, we have like reservoirs that are overflowing from flooding, or we have kind of already impact. In Nova Scotia, we see bridges and roads washed out on a pretty regular basis from some of these major storms that we have. And so it just kind of, at this point we can say, at least in terms of infrastructure, it's climate resilience isn't really just something that is like kind of a luxury item, or like an add-on that's nice. It's kind of it's really is about protecting the investments we're making. If we're spending these billions of dollars on this infrastructure to repair it, to keep it running, it really doesn't make sense to not consider these major effects of storms and flooding and all of these droughts and permafrost and all that in the northern areas. So it really has to be included, because these investments would not be good investments for us to make if we didn't think about all those impacts.
That's a fair answer. And also, I think it speaks to looking to the future, which is where I'm going for my last question. The first NIA is out, but you're still, having meetings, you're plenty busy. What's next for the council?
Yeah, we, as I said, we meet in person like once or twice a year. So we just had our meeting starting off the kind of year two of the process. And I think that we are really interested in diving deeper into some of these questions. So like the asset management side has come up quite a lot. Like, are there tools out there that can help municipalities better manage their assets? Like, do they have asset management plans? Some of them do for one type of infrastructure, but not for the others, or, so there's that kind of like, can we, are there ways that are there tools we can provide municipalities that they can do that kind of work? There's also, on the financing side, I think there's a lot of thought into, again, like, what are some alternative financing? Because, we know that governments can't do this alone. On the data, I would say, side, there is some interest in, do we, if there is missing data, like, can we get that missing data? Can we get municipalities or regions or provinces to basically keep track of their assets using the same type of, variable, like the same type of metrics, I guess. That's come up. So we're kind of at this point, we're moving into, these are like, we basically know now we want to make better use of the infrastructure we have. If we're going to make investments, they have to be, based in data. We know all of those things now. So now it's like, how does this actually happen? Like, what is the implementation side of the NIA now? That's where we're moving into.
That's interesting. Well, planning is definitely a fascinating field. So thank you so much for coming on the show. And while it is, as I said, planning is fascinating, but it's also very complex. And I think you've done just a phenomenal job keeping it simple for us, for our audience, and walking us through the different categories of infrastructure that the NIA looked at. And you mentioned you're starting year two at the council, so I think I'm going to go ahead right now and tell you that I'm probably going to re-invite you when perhaps the second NIA comes out at some point. So Dr. Thomas, thank you so much for making the time, and we look forward to the work of the council.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Intended Consequences. The views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of Strategy Corp. All rights for this episode are reserved, and the guests on the Intended Consequences podcast might be current or past clients of Strategy Corp. To find out more about the work of the Institute and to subscribe to our newsletter, visit our website at strategycorp.com/institute and make sure to follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm Sebastian Lebrec, and I intend to talk to you again next episode.